Welcome back, everyone from all over the world. Thank you so much for joining me. On this segment, we are talking about the wounded worshiper. The wounded worshiper. A preacher by the name of Chuck Swindoll once said, and I quote, "I'm convinced that life is 10% what happens to me and 90% how I react to it." End of quote. In other words, he was saying that our circumstances should not determine our situations. Our circumstances should not determine, control, or define our situations. What happens to us should not define us. What happens to us, what happens to us, should not define who we are, what we are, or how we are. In Mark chapter 5, from verse 1, read with me. This is what it says. Then they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gadarenes. And when he had come out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit, who had his dwelling among the tombs, and no one could bind him, not even with chains, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, and the chains had been pulled apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces. Neither could anyone tame him. And always, night and day, he was in the mountains and in the tombs, crying out and cutting himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and worshipped him. He ran and worshipped him. Let me put in context this scripture that we just read. One day Jesus goes to a region called the Gadarenes, and a man who had led a horrible, sad, lonely life because he was tormented and possessed by an unclean spirit. This man had spent the better part of his life living in the graveyards, screaming and shouting and cutting himself with stones, and no one was able to contain him. They had tried to put shackles and chains on him, but nobody could tame this man because he was possessed, he was tormented, he was controlled by an unclean spirit. So on this fateful day, on this day, Jesus comes to this region where this man is. And the scriptures tell us that this man saw him, this tormented man, this man filled with an unclean spirit, this man who had lived a horrible life, this man saw him. And he ran to Jesus. And the scriptures tell us this wonderful thing happened. This man, this tormented man, this man who has lived in oppression, this man who had lived in shame and in humiliation, this man who had been driven mad by these tormenting spirits, he runs to Jesus and he falls down and he worships him. It is amazing to me when I read this scripture. This man, he had every reason to want nothing to do with Jesus. He had every reason to stay away from anything and anyone that would try to help him or control him. But something inside of him identified who Jesus was. And he sees him and he runs to him and he worships him in spite of his oppression, in spite of him being possessed and controlled by demonic forces, in spite of him having physical, spiritual, mental, relational pain. He comes to Jesus and he doesn't start to cry out, he doesn't start to pray and beg Jesus for help. The first thing that this man does, he worships him. See, in spite of his circumstance. His circumstance was a horrible one. I cannot imagine how this man lived in such torment, living by the graveyards, screaming day and night, unable to be contained by shackles or chain, driven mad by tormenting spirits. This man, in spite of these circumstances, he comes to Jesus and he worships him. Before he's delivered, he worships. Before he's been helped by Jesus, he worships. Before he's gotten any kind of breakthrough, he worships. Before he has been freed, before he receives freedom, before he receives his sanity back, his life back, he worships Jesus. The scripture begins by a man who is wounded, deeply, spiritually wounded, physically broken, emotionally tormented, relational, lonely, not having any kind of relations with family, with friends, because he had been driven mad by these tormenting spirits. And in his state and in his circumstance, he comes to Jesus and he worships. Notice that the first thing that Jesus did when this man worshipped is Jesus dealt with that man's circumstance. That man did not pray. That man did not beg for deliverance. That man worshipped. And when he worshipped Jesus, Jesus immediately addressed his circumstance. His circumstance was he was tormented, oppressed, possessed by an unclean spirit. And when he worshipped Jesus, Jesus immediately addressed that man's circumstance and delivered him from that spirit. The man is wounded. The man comes to Jesus. He worships Jesus. And Jesus addresses that man's circumstance. See, that man worshipped Jesus in spite of his circumstances. His circumstances were horrible. But when he came to Jesus, the first thing that he did, he worshipped Jesus. And Jesus took care of his circumstance. And his situation changed. Our circumstances should never define our situation. This man, he could have let his circumstance, being oppressed, possessed by a demonic spirit, determine his situation. But that's not what he did. In spite of his circumstance, he came and worshipped. Jesus addressed his circumstance because he worshipped and he was delivered and his situation changed. We should be like that man. We should not let our circumstances hinder us from worshiping Jesus. We should not let what we are going through, what has happened to us, determine our situation. Our circumstances do not determine our situations. Our circumstance does not define us. It does not make us who we are. Just because that man was possessed, just because he was filled by an unclean spirit, just because he had been driven mad by the spirits, did not define who that man was. And that's why, in spite of what he was going through, what had happened to him, at him, in him, he came and he worshipped Jesus. It's not uncommon today in our world for many people to connect what is happening to them, what is going on in them, through them, in their lives. It's not uncommon for them to connect what's happening with who they are. That's not how we should be. We should be like a tree that's planted by the rivers. That it doesn't matter when summer changes into fall, fall changes into winter, winter changes into spring, and back to summer. That tree is unmoved, unchanged, unshaken by the changing of the seasons. The circumstances change, the seasons change, the tree remains the same because the tree has roots. And if we are like a tree planted by the springs of water, the seasons in our lives will not determine who we are. The circumstances of our lives will not determine our situations. One man by the name of Job, in one day, he lost his family and he lost his entire wealth. And shortly after, he lost his health. This man had every reason to be bitter, to be angry, to disconnect and distance himself from God. But this man ran to God. This man worshipped God. In fact, his wife told him to curse God and die. But the man refused to do that. And in fact, the man said, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. In spite of his circumstances, he trusted God. In spite of what he was going through, he worshipped God. His circumstances did not determine who he was. He was wounded, but he was a worshiper. The man from Gadarenes was wounded, but he was a worshiper. In spite of our circumstances, we should worship God. I want you to realize that in every situation, God remains the same. We change, but God does not change. And if we have a revelation and understanding that God is unchanging, to the same today, yesterday, and forever, He is our rock. Whether we are in a good season or in a bad season, whether we are happy or sad, whether we are oppressed or we are experiencing freedom, whether we are having breakthroughs or not, we are not defined by our circumstances. Our circumstances do not determine our situations. We trust God in all seasons. Because God is unchanging, we too should be unchanging in how we relate to God. Therefore, let me encourage you. Be a wounded worshiper. If you are going through something, depression or heartache or heartbreak or pain, spiritual pain, physical pain, emotional pain, having difficulty in relations, that should not determine who you are. That should not determine your circumstance. Your circumstances should not change your situation. They should not determine who you are. Who you are is defined by God, and God is unchanging. Therefore, because God is unchanging and what He has said about us is unchanging, in spite of the changes in our life, our circumstances, our situations remain the same. The man worshipped Jesus in spite of him filled with an unclean, horrible spirit. And through that, Jesus addressed that man's circumstance. I pray that God will help us, God will help you, God will help me to become a worshiper in spite of the wounds that we may have. Thank you so much for joining me, for taking this time to be with me. I hope and pray that you'll consider sharing and subscribing to this channel. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord shine His face on you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn His face towards you and give you peace. Shalom. God bless you. Take care.